They thought she was lying. They thought she was pretending. They saw the uniform, the medals, the posture, and still, they saw nothing but a black woman they could dominate. In the blink of an eye, what should have been a routine walk into a federal building turned into a staged spectacle of humiliation. Two police officers, emboldened by power and poisoned by prejudice, didn't ask questions. They didn't check credentials. They didn't even hesitate. They surrounded her. "You can't just waltz into a building like this dressed like that," one of them laughed, gripping the baton at his waist, smirking to his partner. "Halloween's not for another few months." The other officer stepped closer, cocky and casual, speaking with that tone of controlled mockery. "I've seen this before. Some folks will do anything for attention. Uniform and everything. Ma'am, impersonating a federal officer is a felony." She tried to speak. Calm. Measured. The way her training had drilled into her. But when she reached for her ID, slow and deliberate, he drew his weapon. "I said hands where I can see, M. Don't move." Her voice didn't crack. Her hands didn't shake. But something in her heart shifted. Not from fear. From the weight of knowing, no matter how high she rose, no matter the rank on her chest, no matter the lives she'd led or saved, to them, she was just another target. Another stereotype. Another moment of twisted entertainment. They slammed her against the marble wall. The echoes of metal clinking as handcuffs snapped around her wrists reverberated through the lobby. Security didn't intervene. Passers-by watched with casual silence. A few phones were out, but most just turned their heads, unbothered. "You think just 'cause you got some army patches you get to do whatever you want," the officer sneered, leaning in close enough for her to smell his chewing tobacco and ego. "Let me guess, got it off eBay, huh?" She said nothing. He continued, louder this time, for everyone in the lobby to hear. "Let's get her outside. Maybe next time, you'll think twice before playing dress-up in a government building." In that moment, in that surreal, suffocating moment, the silence inside her broke. Not with rage. Not with tears. But with resolve. She lifted her cuffed hands to her chest, tilted her head slightly, and spoke with the kind of quiet authority that silences rooms and commands nations. "I need to make one phone call." They laughed again, shrugging like it was just another part of the act. One of them tossed her a phone like he was throwing scraps. "Knock yourself out, soldier." She dialed. One number. No hesitation. No password. The line picked up before the first full ring. "This is Echo Charlie 9. I'm in custody. Wrongfully detained. Under threat. Location, Federal Building, Midtown." A pause. A heavy pause. Then the voice on the other end replied with the kind of gravity that shakes the earth beneath your feet. "Copy that. Executive clearance initiated. Hold position." She didn't smile. She didn't blink. But in her stillness, there was power. Authority. A storm rising beneath the surface. The officer furrowed his brow. "Who the hell did you just call?" She turned to look at him, not with anger, but with pity. "You'll find out in about 90 seconds. Because what they didn't know, what their racism blinded them from ever imagining, is that the woman they just paraded like a criminal in front of an entire federal building wasn't just any soldier. She was the general. A decorated war hero. A tactical strategist known around the world. One of the highest-ranking women in the military, and one of the few black women to ever wear the stars. And the man she just called wasn't her lawyer. Wasn't her husband. It was her superior, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Armed Forces. In exactly 84 seconds, the building they stood in would be flooded by federal agents. Surveillance footage would be pulled. Witnesses interrogated. Media alerted. The officers, stripped of their badges, arrested, and facing federal charges under the Military Protection Act for the unlawful detainment of a senior military officer on duty. And the world would watch. But the question isn't just what happened next. It's why. Why did these officers feel so certain they were right? Why did no one stop them? Why did a woman who gave her life to serving a country have to be humiliated just to be seen? And more importantly, what happens when the system you serve decides you don't belong, but you're the one who has the power to burn it down from the inside? Stay with us. Because this is not just a story about injustice. It's a story about what happens when justice wears stars on her shoulders, and decides it's time for revenge. To every black viewer watching this story today, we see you. We stand with you. And we believe your experiences matter. Here at Plow of Twist, we do not tolerate racism in any form. Our stories aim to expose injustice, amplify unheard voices, and spark change through truth and powerful narratives. You are not alone, and your story deserves to be told. Enjoy this journey. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Now, let's begin. The sun in Birmingham, Alabama had a certain weight to it, heavy and honest. It didn't just shine, it pressed down, especially in late July, when the air was thick and unyielding, and the days stretched longer than they should. On this particular morning, the city buzzed with its usual rhythms, sirens in the distance, the hum of traffic building as people rushed to jobs, schools, lives that never waited. Amid the clamor, on the steps of a towering federal building made of glass and concrete, the kind that always looked a little too sterile to feel welcoming, stood someone who didn't quite belong to the chaos, but also wasn't separate from it. Her name was Major General Keisha Monroe, and if the people around her had known who she truly was, who she had become, they wouldn't have dared to stare the way they did. Keisha was 46, but her presence carried decades. Her back straightened not from pride, but from practice. Her uniform, perfectly pressed, bore ribbons of campaigns and missions that most civilians had only read about in headlines. Her skin, a deep and luminous brown, glowed not just with resilience, but with hard-earned command. People often whispered about her with awe in military circles, about how she'd risen from enlisted ranks to one of the highest military posts in the country, a woman, black, from a working-class neighborhood in Montgomery. But here, outside this building, without context or name tags, she was just another black woman in a uniform, walking alone. Her decision to walk into that federal building herself, without aid or entourage, wasn't vanity. It was intentional. Keisha didn't believe in delegating presence. The meeting scheduled inside was with a civilian task force, mostly law enforcement, some local government, a few social leaders. The purpose: cooperation between military and civilian forces in disaster management. Nothing high risk. Nothing classified. But something told her this meeting required her personal attention. A storm had been brewing, not in the sky, but in the culture. She'd felt the murmurs, seen the attitudes. There was resistance, not just to cooperation, but to her. Keisha's upbringing taught her to trust her instincts. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and still found time to sew church robes on weekends, Keisha learned the art of discipline early. Her father had vanished before she could walk. Her older brother, Marcus, had been in and out of prison during her teens, a cycle of systemic injustice that marked her family's past but never defined her future. She joined the army at 19, not out of patriotism, but out of necessity. What began as an escape turned into a calling. Keisha discovered something within herself in boot camp, something sharp, unshakable. She was a leader. She didn't scream to be heard. She didn't demand obedience. She earned it. By 32, she was leading battalions overseas. By 40, she was training officers. Her reputation was carved in the quiet strength she carried, the kind that didn't beg for acknowledgement, but left no room for disrespect. Still, even with rank and recognition, Keisha knew one truth better than most: no matter how high she rose, she would always be challenged twice as hard, doubted twice as often. Especially here, especially in the South. On the other side of that federal building, 2 Birmingham police officers had been assigned to the lobby detail that morning. Officer Caleb Harlan, 38, with a jawline sharp enough to cut through protocol and an attitude that smelled of unchecked ego, stood leaning against the security desk. Next to him, Officer Rick Dawson, younger, impressionable, and with a hunger to impress that made him dangerous, watched people pass like they were potential threats. Caleb had been on the force for 15 years. Never promoted. Never reprimanded publicly. But whispers followed him. Excessive force. Bias complaints. Always dropped. Always swept. Rick, only 4 years in, looked up to Caleb like a brother. A mentor. A protector of the real way things worked. Neither of them had been briefed about Keisha's arrival. Or perhaps they had, and ignored it. To them, she wasn't expected. Wasn't familiar. Wasn't right. A black woman walking alone into a restricted access building, wearing military stripes that screamed importance. It didn't matter if she glided with confidence. It didn't matter that her ID hung visibly from her chest. To them, she looked out of place. And out of place meant suspect. As she passed through the metal detector, her boots clicking against the marble floor, Rick nudged Caleb. "You seeing this?" he muttered, eyes narrowing. Caleb didn't look right away. He didn't need to. He'd already made up his mind. "Uniform looks clean," he said flatly. "Too clean. That's not real. Think we should stop her?" Caleb straightened, his smirk subtle, dangerous. "Let's do more than that." They moved toward her with the swagger of men used to being obeyed, even when they were wrong. Keisha, unfazed, extended her identification with practiced ease. "Major General Monroe. I have a scheduled briefing in conference room 4B. Caleb didn't take the badge. He didn't look at it. His eyes went straight to her face, then flicked to Rick as if to say, "Watch this. You got a fake ID, lady. Where'd you get that uniform?" Rick tried to chuckle, but it came out nervous. Keisha didn't flinch. Her voice remained calm. "You're making a mistake. I'm not here for games." Caleb stepped closer. "That right? So how about we verify your identity? You can come with us. We'll make some calls." Keisha's jaw tensed slightly. The building's receptionist began to shift uncomfortably behind the desk. A security guard watched from a distance but said nothing. This wasn't new. People watched and waited. To intervene was to risk more than discomfort. It was easier to stay silent. "I'm here on official business," Keisha said, firmer this time. "Step aside." Rick's hand went to his belt. Caleb's eyes gleamed. That sounded like a threat. "You sure you want to go down that road?" And just like that, it happened. Caleb reached forward, roughly grabbed her arm, and twisted it behind her. The cuffs came out. Keisha didn't resist. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew that resistance would be the story. Not the injustice. Not the disrespect. Just the reaction. So she let it happen. As her wrists were bound behind her, the lobby grew tense. Phones came out. Whispers spread. No one knew who she was. But everyone could feel what it meant. Caleb leaned in, his voice laced with arrogance. "Tell me something, General, ever served a day in your life?" Keisha turned her head slightly. Her eyes met his. She didn't blink. She didn't snarl. She didn't beg. But something in that look, measured, electric, resolute, started a countdown. Because what neither of them realized was that behind those calm eyes, behind that stoic silence, was a woman with the power to dismantle their careers with a single call. A woman who had faced insurgents with less nerve than these 2 men. A woman who, at that very moment, held in her mind a plan sharper than any blade they could draw. What brought her here wasn't just duty. It was a test. And they just failed it. But what happens next? How far does justice reach when the person you thought you could humiliate turns out to be your superior, your reckoning, your undoing? And how do you explain to the world that the woman you just arrested was the very one you were sworn to protect? The answer waits in the silence after power shifts. And when it does, no badge, no lie, no uniform can save you. Inside the concrete walls of the Birmingham Federal Building, time seemed to fracture. Every second stretched longer than it should, every movement felt magnified. The buzz of fluorescent lights above mixed with the murmurs of a growing crowd, some whispering in disbelief, others filming quietly from the sidelines, unsure whether they were witnessing an incident or an injustice. Keisha Monroe, still restrained, still held upright with the rigid poise of a seasoned officer, didn't move a muscle. Her hands were behind her back, her dignity was on full display, and yet her captors, Caleb and Rick, were completely blind to the weight of the mistake they had made. Rick began pacing, his nervousness now more obvious as the moment drew attention neither of them had expected. "Maybe we should have called it in," he said in a low voice, avoiding eye contact with Keisha. "I mean, just in case. We don't know who she really is." Caleb waved him off with a scoff, adjusting the radio clip to his shoulder. "Nah. She's putting on a show. Just another fraud trying to intimidate with a costume. You think a real general walks around alone, no driver, no escort? Don't be stupid." Keisha's eyes followed Caleb as he circled her, and for a moment, he paused. He could feel it, there was something in her silence, a presence far too composed for someone being publicly humiliated. She wasn't pleading, wasn't raising her voice, wasn't doing what people usually did when caught in something this big. That unnerved him, even if he couldn't admit it. So he did what people like him always did when faced with someone they didn't understand, he doubled down. "All right, lady," he said louder this time, for the whole lobby to hear. "Let's make this official. I'm detaining you on suspicion of impersonating a military officer, unlawful entry into a federal building, and refusal to comply with orders." Keisha tilted her head slightly and spoke for the first time in minutes, her voice calm, deliberate, unshaken. "And when this is over, and it will be over, you'll remember every word you just said." The receptionist flinched. A few feet away, an older woman whispered to her husband, asking if they should call someone. The man simply shook his head, eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. "Let them hang themselves," he muttered. "This'll be all over the news by nightfall." Upstairs, the conference room that had been scheduled for the interagency meeting sat empty. The military aides who had arrived early were now watching the scene on a surveillance feed, brows furrowed, unsure of how to act. They weren't allowed to intervene directly without a command. They had protocols. But one of them, a lieutenant named Harris, had already made a quiet phone call. Not to report a disturbance, but to someone higher. Way higher. Back downstairs, Rick finally approached Caleb with a strained whisper. "Dude, we need to figure this out fast. I just got a ping on the internal system, someone flagged our body cams. There's external review activity going on." Caleb stiffened. "What?" "I don't know, man," Rick replied, glancing at Keisha. "This isn't normal. She hasn't said a word since that call. Like she's not worried. At all." "She should be," Caleb snapped back, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. At that moment, two building security guards approached, older men who knew better than to challenge the police outright but also recognized the danger in the silence surrounding the arrest. One of them, Davis, cleared his throat. "Officers, we just got a call from the director's office. They're requesting clarification on an incident involving a high-ranking visitor." Rick looked like he was about to pass out. Caleb, on the other hand, raised his voice again. "I don't care who called who. This woman is under suspicion. If someone's got a problem with it, they can talk to me directly." "You might get your wish," Davis said quietly, stepping back. Keisha finally exhaled, slowly. You've got about 2 minutes left, she said, looking Caleb directly in the eye. He glared back. What is that? A threat? It's not a threat, she replied, her voice now carrying the kind of power that silenced the room. It's a warning. Up above, another phone rang. A private line. A single word was spoken into the receiver, hold. Meanwhile, Rick moved to the side, pulling out his phone and checking it discreetly. His face drained of color. He walked back to Caleb, his voice nearly trembling now. She's in the system, man. I just found her profile. She's not just a general, she's the Major General Monroe. She's the Monroe Joint Task Commander. Pentagon level. We screwed up. Caleb didn't respond. His face hardened, but not in confidence. In panic. Keisha, despite the tightness in her wrists, stood a little taller. Her voice no longer needed to raise. The silence did all the work. You can still fix this. But only if you listen. You've got one chance. But Caleb wasn't ready to listen. Men like him never were, until it was too late. From outside the glass entrance, black SUVs began to appear. 1. Then 2. Then 4. Unmarked. Dark-tinted. Moving in coordinated precision. Rick saw them first. What the hell, the lobby went quieter. Conversations stopped. Phones were lowered. A man in a dark suit stepped out from the lead SUV, walked calmly to the door, and opened it without hesitation. Major General Monroe, he said, loud enough for the lobby to hear. Ma'am, we've come to escort you to your meeting. Apologies for the delay. That's when Caleb stepped back, just half a step. Enough for everyone to notice. Keisha didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Rick fumbled for the keys to the cuffs, struggling to unlock them with shaking hands. When they finally came off, she didn't rub her wrists. She didn't react. She simply turned to face the man who had arrested her, looking directly into his eyes. Do you understand now? She asked. Caleb opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Outside, a camera flash lit up the entrance. A journalist had arrived. So had 2 more vehicles. And somewhere in the flurry of movement, voices began to murmur louder, questions started to be asked, and the storm Keisha had felt building all week, was here. The mistake wasn't just in the arrest. It was in believing that a black woman in uniform couldn't be the one in charge. And the price for that mistake? That part, was just beginning. Because what was about to happen next, what no one in that building could have anticipated, was going to change the careers, the reputations, and the futures of everyone involved. And it was all triggered by one moment. One assumption. One act of disrespect too many. But who exactly made the call that turned the tide? And what does justice look like, when it doesn't come with a warning? Everything was about to unravel. And not everyone would survive the truth. The atmosphere inside the federal building had shifted in a way that was almost physical. No alarms had gone off, no weapons drawn, no public announcement made, and yet, there was a pressure in the air, thick and undeniable, the kind that signaled something massive was about to erupt. The temperature of the room hadn't changed, but everyone could feel the heat. The silence that wrapped around the lobby wasn't born of peace, it was tension, waiting to snap. And in the center of it all stood Keisha Monroe, no longer in handcuffs, no longer silent, and very much no longer alone. The man in the tailored black suit, who had addressed her moments ago as Major General Monroe, remained by her side, composed, a thin earpiece in his right ear and a hard expression on his face that didn't flinch once. The doors behind him opened again, and this time the air shifted completely. 2 high-ranking military officials entered, flanked by civilian legal advisors, one holding a thin folder, the other already on the phone. Keisha didn't move. She remained still as the chaos organized itself around her. She hadn't come to demand justice. She was the justice. Rick had retreated to the edge of the lobby, near a marble pillar, his face pale, sweating through the collar of his uniform. He wasn't speaking anymore. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't even blinking properly. The reality of what was happening had sunk in so deep that he couldn't find the words to ask the question haunting him: how had they misread the moment that badly? Caleb, meanwhile, still stood firm in posture but not in presence. His eyes darted from the men entering the building to the people now documenting the event from every angle. His radio crackled with static, someone from headquarters trying to reach him, but he didn't lift it. Keisha took a step forward. It was subtle, but it made the entire room contract. One of the legal advisors leaned toward the man in the suit, speaking low and fast. The man nodded once, then turned to address the entire lobby, not with anger, but with institutional finality. "This is now a classified personnel investigation under federal jurisdiction," he stated. "All civilian staff will step aside. Officers Harlan and Dawson, you are ordered to remain in place. You will not be removed, but you will comply fully. Is that clear?" Caleb opened his mouth, and for a moment, he sounded almost human. "Sir, I think there's been some kind of mistake," the man interrupted. "There has. And you made it." That landed harder than any accusation. Keisha finally looked at Rick. Not with vengeance. With something heavier. Disappointment. "You were told to think," she said, her voice low but sharp. "You were told to observe. You chose assumption instead." Rick looked down, his voice cracking. "I didn't know who you were, but you knew what I looked like," she replied, her gaze fixed, her words deliberate. "That was enough for you to decide what I wasn't." The crowd outside had grown. Through the glass, people pressed to get a better view. News vans had parked across the street, and the building's lobby had become the epicenter of a story that would erupt across the country before the day was done. Upstairs, military staff were mobilizing communications teams, preparing statements, bracing for the impact that would ripple from this one incident. Then came the moment that changed everything. A voice came from the doorway, measured, male, commanding in tone but not aggressive. "Major General Monroe." Keisha turned. There he stood. General Robert E. Halverson, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, in full-service uniform, medals glinting against his chest. His presence silenced even the buzz of cameras. He walked forward without hesitation and extended his hand, not out of courtesy, but of respect. "Your call was received," he said. "And the situation has been reviewed." Keisha nodded once. Then Halverson turned to Caleb and Rick, his face unreadable. "You're both under immediate administrative suspension, pending federal investigation into misconduct, abuse of authority, unlawful detainment of a superior officer, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Effective now." Caleb blinked, finally breaking. "Sir, with all due respect, no," Halverson cut in. "Respect is earned. You lost at the moment you laid a hand on her." Rick looked like he wanted to vanish. Caleb clenched his fists, his arrogance beginning to peel off in layers. "This is insane," he muttered. "This isn't how it works, this is exactly how it works when the chain of command is respected," Halverson replied. "You just didn't expect the chain to end with her." Keisha stepped forward again, her boots echoing across the polished floor. "This was never about punishment," she said, her voice rising just enough to be heard by everyone. "This was about exposure. Because this building, this city, this country, has been hiding too long behind ranks and badges. And the moment those symbols stop standing for truth, they become weapons." She turned toward the room now, not just the two men. "This isn't just about me. This is about every officer who walked through that door and had to prove their worth 3 times over because of the color of their skin, because of their gender, because they didn't fit your idea of what authority looks like. That ends today. And it starts right here." The cameras had picked up everything. Outside, networks were already crafting headlines. Inside, Caleb and Rick were quietly escorted by two military security officers, unarmed and unspoken. Rick didn't resist. Caleb didn't speak. Their careers had ended before they even stepped outside. But this wasn't about revenge. Not to Keisha. This was about the system seeing itself, raw and ugly, in the reflection of its own actions. Halverson approached her once more. The Secretary of Defense will be briefed within the hour. You're being reassigned to lead the Internal Review Committee. Full authority. Full access. Keisha nodded slowly. Good. Because I'm not finished. The moment was still. No celebration. No applause. Just clarity. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it walked in calm. But when it moved with purpose. And now, it was moving through her. Outside, the Alabama sun had no idea it was shining down on the birth of something irreversible. But inside those walls, under artificial lights, behind polished marble and tinted glass, the temperature of everything had changed. Keisha Monroe stood with the calm of a soldier but the fire of a woman who had waited too many years, endured too many silences, and carried too many burdens that were not hers to bear. There was no more noise. No more resistance. Only the echo of consequences starting to settle in the walls of every person who had watched, judged, recorded, or stood silent. General Halverson remained by her side, not as a savior, but as a witness. His presence made things official, but her presence made them matter. The building's internal communications director, a woman in her late 50s with glasses and a tight bun, stepped into the lobby with a visible tremor in her hands. She held a clipboard but lowered it immediately when Keisha's eyes met hers. Major General, she began, struggling to find the right tone, I just wanted to personally apologize. We had no idea. Keisha interrupted her, not harshly, but with precision. You didn't have to know who I was to intervene. You just had to know what was right. The woman nodded, ashamed, and backed away. Keisha turned then, walked slowly toward the central corridor, not rushed, not afraid of what came next. Rick was seated now, handcuffed on a bench reserved for visitors who failed security clearance. His head was in his hands. Not crying, just stunned. The weight of what he had participated in was heavier than his training ever prepared him for. When Keisha passed, he looked up, desperate for something, understanding, forgiveness, even confrontation. I didn't mean for it to go that far, he said, his voice a whisper, barely carrying over the hum of overhead lights. I was just following protocol. She stopped. Protocol is only as strong as the judgment of the people enforcing it, she said, not turning to face him yet. And you didn't follow it. You followed Caleb. He swallowed hard. He's always been like that. I didn't want to look weak. I didn't think. She turned slowly now, locking eyes with him. You didn't have to think. You just had to listen. To question. To be human. He looked down again, unable to hold her gaze. Sometimes, she continued, softer now, the worst damage isn't caused by those who swing the sword, but by those who hold the scabbard and say nothing. He nodded once, a tear escaping before he could catch it. She didn't speak again. There was no need. Mercy didn't always come in words. Sometimes, it came in the silence of not giving someone what they feared most. She left him there, alone with the weight of his own choices. In the command center 2 floors above, military personnel and civilian staff were gathered, watching live feeds, reviewing footage, documenting every second for the internal report. Halverson joined her as she entered, but even he kept a respectful distance now. Keisha didn't command the room, she became it. No need for raised voices or slammed fists. She stood before the screen showing Caleb now being led to a secure vehicle, hands bound, expression blank. A junior officer nearby whispered, "Is it true he was up for promotion next quarter?" Keisha answered without turning. He was. But power doesn't promote character. It reveals it. The room fell silent. Another official cleared his throat. The media is requesting a statement. They're spinning two narratives, abuse of power, and institutional failure. What do you want the story to be? Keisha turned to face him directly. The truth. There was no branding strategy, no media polish needed. The truth had already arrived and carved itself into the eyes and minds of everyone watching. An older lieutenant, black, maybe in his late 50s, stepped forward from the back. His name tag read D. Marshall, and his voice cracked slightly when he spoke. I've served 32 years, ma'am. I've had moments like that. Not that public, but just as real. You did something today none of us ever thought we'd live to see. Keisha's eyes softened. She knew that voice, that weight. It shouldn't take a scandal for truth to be respected, she said. But maybe, now, they'll start to see the truth doesn't need their permission. He nodded and stepped back. The room held its breath, a strange reverence hanging between them all. Downstairs, the press was assembling. Questions were shouted into the glass, none of which were answered. The building remained in lockdown, but it no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a courtroom. One where finally, the walls were listening. Keisha's phone vibrated. She checked the ID, Secretary Langford. She answered. No hesitation. General Monroe, his voice came through, calm and deliberate, I've just concluded a call with the President. We are authorizing a full review into not just the incident, but the policies that made it possible. You'll lead it. I accept, she said plainly. I had no doubt, he replied. Then, softer, we failed you. The system did. No, sir, she said. The system worked exactly how it was designed. Now it's time to redesign it. He exhaled on the other end. We'll brief the Pentagon in 2 hours. But for now, take a moment. You've earned it. She ended the call. She didn't take a moment. Instead, she walked out of the room, into the hallway, and down a side corridor few people used. A quiet space. There, against the wall, was a bench, just like the ones in the lobby. She sat, hands on her knees, and finally let herself feel the adrenaline ebbing. She wasn't exhausted. She was clear. For the first time in a long time, clarity wasn't a theory, it was real. Tangible. And hers. Footsteps approached. She didn't look up until the voice followed. You handled that with more grace than I ever could have. It was Lieutenant Colonel Simmons, her closest aide. A woman who had watched her career rise from the back lines to the front pages. Her eyes were glossy. I didn't handle it for grace, Keisha said. I handled it because I knew they'd try to define me by my reaction. They always do. Simmons sat beside her. You changed the way people will see this uniform. No, Keisha replied. I reminded them who's wearing it. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Simmons asked the question that had been hanging in the air since it all began. What made you walk in there alone, Keisha? No backup. No team. Why? Keisha leaned back, eyes on the ceiling tiles. Because I needed them to see it. With their own eyes. No filter. No warning. Just the truth, walking straight through the front door. She stood then, taller than before. Not because she'd won, but because she had endured. What comes next? Simmons asked. Keisha looked down the hallway, where justice had finally turned its gaze inward. Next, she said. We don't knock anymore. We walk in. By late afternoon, the city's heartbeat had shifted. What began as a spark of outrage behind federal walls had now become a wildfire across every screen, feed, and frequency. Social media erupted with clips from the lobby, with stills of Keisha Monroe standing dignified in uniform, arms restrained yet eyes unyielding. Hashtags flooded timelines, commentary poured in from veterans, community leaders, journalists, and ordinary people who'd seen themselves in that moment, seen what it meant to be powerful and yet profiled, to be honorable and still humiliated. But inside those federal walls, where the echo of boots and betrayal still hung in the air, the focus had already moved past the incident itself. The reckoning had begun. Keisha hadn't left the building. Not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. There was still too much to do, too much left to face, and the most difficult part wasn't over. Upstairs in a private conference room now sealed to media and non-essential personnel, she sat at the head of a long table flanked by brass and black suits. Across from her were internal affairs officers, civilian legal consultants, and policy enforcement representatives flown in that same afternoon. There were folders stacked high, security footage queued on laptops, but none of them were as important as the question that hung thick in the air: what now? She didn't speak immediately. Her silence wasn't empty. It was strategy. Let them feel the gravity of the room before giving them language to carry it. Then finally, her voice rang clear across the table. We're not going to make this go away quietly. Not with statements. Not with reassignment. This isn't about fixing a mistake, it's about confronting a design. The civilian oversight director shifted in his chair, clearly uneasy. With respect, General, are you implying that the incident is rooted in structural failure rather than individual misconduct? Keisha didn't blink. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating it. The incident is just the symptom. The illness is older, deeper, and defended by policy loopholes and cultural blind spots you've ignored for decades. The room was silent, but no one objected. They couldn't. She wasn't wrong. Halverson leaned forward, eyes sharp but supportive. The Secretary of Defense has granted you discretionary power over the investigative board. Full authority. That includes personnel evaluations and cultural competency oversight across the entire Southeastern Division. Keisha's tone remained steady. Then let's start with Birmingham. Someone across the table raised a legal concern. If we pursue disciplinary action across the department, we'll need airtight documentation and bipartisan support. It won't hold if it looks like retribution. She turned toward him slowly. Retribution would be ending a man's career in secret. I want this public. Transparent. Retribution is silence. What I'm after is accountability. She stood then, walked to the wall where a digital map of the southeastern precincts glowed in soft blue. Her finger pointed to 4 divisions that had submitted reports in the last 12 months related to excessive force, racial profiling, and disciplinary inconsistencies. All had been dismissed for lack of evidence. None had included testimony from the individuals involved. These patterns don't form by coincidence, she said. They form by design. A culture that protects authority over integrity isn't broken, it's functioning exactly as intended. And it's time we dismantle it. At that, one of the civilian officers across the room, a woman named Rachel with a background in legal reform, looked up with something close to admiration in her eyes. You're not trying to repair this system, she said. You're trying to redefine it. Keisha turned, her eyes calm but unyielding. I've spent my entire career being told to adapt to a system that was never built for me. I adapted. I excelled. And still, I was detained, doubted, dismissed. So no, I'm not going to patch the walls of a building that was constructed to exclude people like me. I'm tearing the whole damn blueprint apart. The gravity of her words filled the room, reshaping the tension into resolve. But not everyone was ready to follow. Downstairs, Officer Dawson had requested a private conversation. Despite legal counsel advising against it, he was granted 10 minutes under watch. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for leniency. He asked for Keisha. She accepted. They met in a closed conference room near the lobby, no cameras, no press, only the presence of 2 silent guards stationed outside. Rick sat with his shoulders hunched, his posture no longer forced into the illusion of strength. Keisha entered and didn't sit immediately. She stood across from him, arms folded behind her back, watching. He looked up, his voice raw. "I didn't sleep last night. I couldn't. I kept thinking about what you said, about holding the scabbard." She didn't respond. "I didn't stop him. I didn't ask questions. I just followed, like it was easier to obey than to think. I've done that more than I want to admit. Sometimes I tell myself I was just trying to survive this job." Keisha tilted her head slightly. "And did it ever occur to you that for people like me, surviving you is the job?" His lips parted, but no words came. "I didn't ask to be your lesson," she continued, voice firm but never raised. "I didn't ask to be your awakening. But here we are." He nodded, shame tightening every line in his face. "I want to do better. I want to help. But I don't know if that matters anymore." She finally sat then, folding her hands. "You can't undo what you did. But you can make sure the next person doesn't repeat it. Help with the review board. Testify. Use your name. Your silence helped enable him, now let your voice help dismantle him." Rick nodded. He was still shaking. Keisha stood again. "You're not forgiven because you feel guilty. You're forgiven when you choose to be useful." Then she left. As she walked back through the building, the people in the halls shifted. Some made way out of respect. Others out of guilt. A few nodded in silent gratitude. But all of them, every single one, had seen something shift that day. Power had changed shape. And Keisha wasn't done shaping it. What none of them knew, not even Halverson, was that Keisha had drafted a policy recommendation already. One that would strip immunity protections for officers engaged in racial misconduct, that would make psychological evaluations and cultural bias training mandatory quarterly requirements, that would require every department to report racially based complaints to a federal database for public review. She wasn't just responding to an incident. She was preparing a movement. But with power came sacrifice. And the final cost was yet to come. That night, as she sat in her apartment, alone for the first time since the morning of the incident, Keisha received a call from an unfamiliar number. She answered cautiously. "General Monroe," the voice said, male, southern, measured, "this is Councilman Frank Talbot. We've never met, but I wanted to speak with you privately." She remained silent. "You've made enemies," he continued. "Real ones. Ones that don't mind losing a few officers if it means keeping their grip tight." "I'm not surprised," she replied calmly. "They're already pushing back. Behind closed doors. Quietly. Don't let the cameras fool you, some of them are waiting for this to blow over so they can put the machine back together." She exhaled slowly. "Then I'll just have to build something they can't take apart." But the councilman wasn't finished. "Just watch your back, General. You're not fighting a scandal. You're fighting legacy." She hung up. And stared into the dark. The reckoning wasn't over. It was just beginning. The city's lights shimmered against the windows of Keisha Monroe's apartment, soft glows dancing across her face as she sat in silence, cross-legged on the floor, the weight of the day refusing to lift. Her boots lay neatly by the door, untouched since she'd returned. The room was quiet, but her mind wasn't. There was no solace in victory when the battlefield stretched beyond the moment. She wasn't thinking about headlines or applause. She was thinking about the eyes of young cadets watching her career unfold in real time. She was thinking about every silent nod she received in the hallways from officers too afraid to speak their truths. And she was thinking about the voice of Councilman Talbot, warning her that behind every reform came a countermeasure, behind every movement a counterforce, sharpened in the dark by those who never intended to lose power. Her phone vibrated again, this time with a message. Not an alert. A video. She opened it without hesitation. The footage showed an older white man, retired colonel, familiar from defense briefings, speaking on a conservative broadcast. "There's a line between reform and revenge," he was saying, his tone firm but slick. "What we're seeing is the military being turned into a political weapon. These types of public stunts don't bring healing. They divide our institutions. They make enemies out of allies." Keisha's jaw tightened. Not because of the criticism. She'd been critiqued her entire life. But because of the way his words would be received. Carefully packaged racism dressed as decorum. The type that spread fast because it never raised its voice. Moments later, another call came through. This time, it was Simmons. "You saw it?" she asked without preamble. "I did," Keisha replied. "They're mobilizing narratives. They want to paint you as dangerous. Divisive." Keisha stood and walked toward her kitchen, flicking on the light, pouring water with steady hands. "Good," she said. "That means they're scared." Simmons was quiet on the line, then asked, "Are you scared?" Keisha stared out the window. "Yes," she said, finally. "But fear doesn't control me. It fuels me." The next morning, Keisha arrived at the federal building before sunrise. The streets were quiet, but inside the building, the energy was tense. News anchors were stationed across the street, legal consultants buzzed between floors, and a special task force had arrived to begin the process of reviewing cases and internal reports. Keisha met with Halverson in a glass-walled office on the top floor. The view overlooked the city, but the tone in the room was anything but detached. "They're pushing back harder than expected," he said. "State politicians, media alliances, even donors. The usual suspects. Some think this will pass. That public outrage will shift in a few days." "It always does," Keisha answered, removing a file from her bag. "That's why we don't build movements on outrage. We build them on facts." She handed him the file. Inside were over 50 documented complaints filed over the last 8 years, many dismissed, others quietly settled, all involving racial profiling or misuse of authority. Keisha had personally redacted identifying details, organizing them by pattern and policy. This wasn't an accusation. It was a case. Halverson flipped through the pages slowly. "You've been building this for years." "Longer than that," she said. "But I never had the power to make it count until now." He closed the file and looked at her. "You're about to make a lot of enemies, Monroe." She didn't flinch. "I didn't take this uniform to be liked. I took it to lead." Downstairs, a scheduled press conference had already begun. The lobby had been transformed into a temporary media space, a banner of the U.S. Army draped behind the podium. Cameras flashed as Keisha entered, stepping into the spotlight without hesitation. She didn't read from a script. Her words came clear, slow, direct. "The events of the past week have made one thing clear: uniforms are not always shields. Authority, without accountability, becomes a weapon. And silence, in the face of injustice, is complicity. I did not come here to expose a moment. I came here to expose a pattern. And today, we begin to break it." Reporters shouted questions. One voice pierced through. "General Monroe, what would you say to those who claim you're exploiting your rank for political gain?" She didn't hesitate. "I would say that being black, being a woman, and being in command isn't exploitation. It's evolution. I didn't create this narrative. I just refuse to stay quiet in it." Another reporter asked, "What message are you sending to officers who feel targeted by this process?" Keisha's voice dropped just slightly, a weight carried in every word. "If you're afraid of being exposed, ask yourself why. Integrity doesn't fear transparency." After the conference, she was approached by a woman in her early 30s, dressed in plain clothes but with a badge clipped to her belt. Her name was Elena Ruiz, an investigator newly assigned to the Oversight Board. She extended her hand. I just wanted to say, thank you. I've been in internal affairs for 8 years. I've seen a lot of things I couldn't stop. Not because I didn't want to, but because the people in charge didn't care. Keisha shook her hand. They care now. Elena nodded. Yes, ma'am. And we've got a lot of work to do. That night, Keisha returned home to find an envelope slid under her door. No name, no return address. Inside was a single page. No threats. No slurs. Just 5 typed words, "You're not untouchable, General." She stared at it for a long time, then folded it once and placed it in a drawer beside other documents. Not out of fear. Out of record keeping. She wasn't naive. She knew what happened when you shifted power. Resistance didn't just push back. It struck from the shadows. But she also knew something else. They wouldn't come for her in the dark. She was already standing in the light. And the fight was only just beginning. The next morning began not with the sound of her alarm, but with the persistent knock at her door. 3 sharp raps. Not urgent, but intentional. Keisha Monroe opened the door to find Elena Ruiz standing on the threshold, dressed in plain clothes, but with tension stretched across her shoulders like armor. She held a sealed folder, fingers tight around the edges, and a look in her eyes that said this wasn't just a visit. It was a warning. Keisha stepped aside, allowing her in without a word. They moved into the living room, both standing, as if sitting would make the truth harder to hold. We got access to internal communication logs from precinct headquarters, Elena said, handing over the file. These were pulled at the request of the Federal Review Board. You're not going to like what you read. Keisha opened it. Pages of messages, some coded, others blatant. Threads of conversation between officers, high-ranking officials, even a few external consultants. All discussing ways to minimize her visibility, cast doubt on her leadership, and, most concerning, maneuver politically to suppress the reform package she drafted. One message in particular stood out, circled in red by Elena. It read, "If we wait long enough, she'll overstep. They always do. Let the uniform blind them, and then we cut." Keisha read the sentence 3 times, letting it marinate in her chest before speaking. They're not just defending a structure, she said. They're defending the mythology that protects it. Elena nodded. They're betting on time. On the public's attention span. On political exhaustion. Keisha closed the file slowly, setting it on the table between them. Then we don't give them time. What are you thinking? Keisha looked up, her gaze sharpened not by anger but by clarity. We go public. Not with the files, yet, but with the truth behind the silence. We control the narrative before they bury it. They want to frame this as emotional retaliation. Let's show them this is structural discipline. Later that day, Keisha held a private meeting with a selected group of community leaders, officers of color from various branches, and legal allies from the reform coalition she'd helped build quietly over the past few years. They gathered in a neutral location, an old community center tucked behind a library in North Birmingham, free from the surveillance and political noise of the downtown Federal Building. Inside that small room, filled with plastic chairs and buzzing fluorescents, a different kind of war council was formed. I know you're all risking something by being here, Keisha began, scanning their faces. I know that aligning yourself publicly with me might cost you opportunities. Might put targets on your backs. A man in the back, Corporal Malik Harris, shook his head. Some of us already have targets. We're just tired of acting like we don't see them. Another voice followed, a woman in uniform, Captain Denise LaRue. I joined the force to protect my people. Not to be told they're the problem. We're with you, General. But we need to know what the next move is. We can't afford another scandal. We need strategy. Keisha stepped forward, her voice low, but certain. Then we do this by their rules, and better. Every accusation, we meet with a documented truth. Every smear, we counter with service records, testimonials, facts. We use their systems against them. Not to destroy them, but to rebuild them. The room grew quiet with agreement. Tension still simmered, fear was natural, but hope had begun to take root. Not the blind kind. The kind born from preparation. From plan. From knowing the enemy had already fired their first shots, and all that remained was whether they'd be allowed to reload. That night, Simmons joined Keisha in her office at headquarters. It was past 10. Most of the building was empty. The city below shimmered through the windows like a reflection of what might still be possible. Simmons dropped a stack of updated reports on Keisha's desk, community feedback, social media analytics, and internal military polling. The numbers were shifting. Support was rising. And with it, resistance. Your approval among enlisted officers has spiked, Simmons said, leaning against the wall. Even in conservative divisions. They're watching. Keisha looked up. But watching isn't acting. They will. When the time comes. Keisha stood, stretching her shoulders, exhaustion hiding beneath her posture. The time is already here. We can't wait for people to get comfortable with the idea of change. Change doesn't ask for comfort. It demands courage. Simmons walked over, resting her hand on the back of the chair across from Keisha's desk. You're doing more than they ever thought possible. But you know how this ends, don't you? Keisha's eyes met hers. Not yet. But I know how it can begin again. Simmons hesitated, then asked what she hadn't dared until now. Do you ever think about walking away? Keisha turned toward the window, her silhouette cast in faint orange light. Every day. And every day I remember what happens if I do. They fill the silence with stories that erase us. So no, I don't walk away. I walk forward. Even if it's alone. Simmons didn't reply. She didn't have to. The next morning, Keisha's internal proposal, titled Reconstruction, Ethics, Equity, and Enforcement Reform Blueprint, was submitted to the Department of Defense, accompanied by co-signatures from 23 active duty officers, 7 civilian board members, and 2 retired generals. It was clear, precise, and impossible to misinterpret. It demanded structural accountability at every level and laid out a detailed plan for nationwide implementation. And with that submission came the next storm. Media allies of the resistance launched opinion pieces almost instantly. Is Keisha Monroe overstepping? One headline read. The danger of militarized activism, said another. Panelists debated her every word. Some called her courageous. Others accused her of undermining chain of command. One even went so far as to label her a threat to military unity. Keisha didn't flinch. But something changed when she received a second envelope at her apartment. This one was different. No note. Just a photo of her mother's house in Montgomery. No words. No threats. Just a silent message. She stood in the middle of her living room, holding the image with steady hands. She didn't shake. Didn't cry. But Simmons could see the shift in her when she arrived 15 minutes later. They want you scared, Simmons said. They don't understand, Keisha replied, voice flat. I've lived with fear longer than they've lived with power. She folded the photo, placed it in the same drawer as the first note, and turned back to her desk. Let them come, she said. I'm not running. And for the first time in decades, the system wasn't ready for a soldier who refused to kneel. It didn't end with a press conference or a viral moment. It ended in a courtroom. A place where the walls held secrets and silence, and truth had to fight harder than ever to be heard. Keisha Monroe sat at the front of the packed federal hearing room, not in uniform this time, but in a dark gray suit that held its own weight. Before her sat a panel of military and civilian officials, congressional aides, ethics officers, and Defense Department representatives. The room was tense but quiet, all eyes on her. She wasn't being tried. She wasn't defending herself. She was testifying, not about a moment, but about a system. And she didn't hold back. She spoke of patterns, records, protection built into policy, invisible codes of silence, and the slow, deliberate erosion of trust within institutions meant to protect. She walked the panel through her blueprint for reform, piece by piece, exposing not just broken procedures but the mindset that allowed them to persist. Her voice didn't tremble once. It didn't need to. The evidence was louder than outrage. After the hearing, a motion was introduced to approve the implementation of her proposal across 6 regional divisions as a federal pilot program. It passed. Narrowly. But it passed. And that victory wasn't just political, it was historical. Within months, military training programs nationwide began incorporating revised cultural literacy protocols. Complaint systems were redesigned with third-party oversight. Immunity clauses for certain abuses were suspended under new guidelines. And Keisha Monroe was appointed as the first black woman to lead the new National Ethics and Conduct Bureau, a post that had never existed until she forced it into being. Her office wasn't in a corner or behind glass. It was built right into the floor where complaints were processed. She wanted to be near the people. Accessible. Accountable. As for Caleb Harlan, he was dishonorably discharged from his post after the investigation revealed not just the incident with Keisha, but 3 additional misconduct cases previously buried by supervisors. One of those cases involved the illegal detainment of a black teenager falsely accused of shoplifting. The family, now empowered by Keisha's case, filed a federal lawsuit. Caleb's badge was taken, his pension revoked, and his name became synonymous with everything wrong in the department's culture. Publicly disgraced, he disappeared from the public eye. Last anyone heard, he was working private security in a remote construction site. There were no headlines. Just silence. The kind that follows those who thought power could protect them forever. Rick Dawson chose a different path. After offering full cooperation to the internal board, he testified in multiple hearings, acknowledging not only what he'd done but why he'd done it, his fear of confrontation, his blind loyalty, his failure to see humanity where uniform told him otherwise. His testimony helped shape the empathy clause in Keisha's reforms, an education module that required officers to confront their own implicit biases with immersive training and real community engagement. Rick stepped away from law enforcement. Not because he was forced to, but because he knew he didn't belong in that space anymore. He went on to volunteer at youth mentorship programs in Birmingham and surrounding towns, working specifically with young men of color. His past never left him, but he used it as currency to build something new. It didn't make him a hero. But it made him useful. And Keisha had told him once, that's where redemption begins. Simmons remained by Keisha's side throughout the transformation. Fiercely loyal, always sharp, she eventually accepted a promotion of her own, leading a new internal resilience task force designed to care for the mental health and emotional stability of soldiers impacted by trauma, especially trauma caused by injustice within the very system they served. She became the bridge between power and care, proof that strength didn't mean detachment. Her division gained national recognition within a year. The man behind the anonymous threats, the one who had sent the photos, was eventually identified as a retired political strategist tied to a lobby group that had publicly opposed Keisha's reforms. He was arrested on charges of harassment and federal intimidation. But Keisha never once addressed his name in public. When asked why, she simply said, "He wanted to scare me into silence. I won't give him the honor of a spotlight." And her mother, her quiet, church-sewing, wisdom-filled mother, was moved from her modest home in Montgomery into a secured residence closer to Keisha. She still baked every Sunday, still refused to let anyone else do her laundry, and still called Keisha by her full name when she got too proud. But more than anything, she sat front row when Keisha received the Presidential Medal of Honor for Public Integrity, wearing a purple dress and tears that held decades of prayers. As for Keisha, she remained steady. Not untouchable. Not invincible. but unshaken. She knew the fight wasn't over. She knew new resistance would rise. But she also knew the power of a single moment, a single decision to not look down when the world tries to put you beneath it. And she never walked through a building the same way again. Not because she had something to prove. But because now, they knew who she was before she ever opened her mouth. The general who didn't break. The woman who turned humiliation into revolution. Now, let me ask you something. How many times have we witnessed injustice and chosen silence over discomfort? How often do we look away because we're afraid to lose something, status, approval, safety? Keisha's story reminds us that courage doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes, it starts in small moments, when you choose to speak, to stand, to resist being reduced. And maybe, just maybe, her story stirred something in you. A question. A reflection. A responsibility. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel, then tell us in the comments. Share your thoughts. Share your own stories. Because this space is ours, and every voice matters here. And if you believe in powerful, unexpected stories that challenge, inspire, and twist the way you see the world, subscribe to Tales of Twist and be part of this journey with us. We're just getting started.